what has been shared today has been an encouragement to you and maybe stirred some questions, and we want to give an opportunity for you to ask questions to myself and Bruce as it relates to Calvary Church Planting Network, and then also to Rob as it relates to some of the things he shared with the philosophy of ministry of Calvary Chapel, and then with Pastor Mickey as well as it relates to just the integrity and character of the church planting pastor or just the Christian in general. So let's have these guys come back up, and what we'll do is, if you would, just line up in this aisle right here. George is going to hold a microphone down there, and if you've got a question, you can come up to the microphone and ask it, and then we would answer those if you have them. So don't be scared. I know these guys are really intimidating. Come on up to the microphone if you wouldn't mind, guys.
Well, since no one else is asking any questions, I kind of talked to a couple of you guys, but just want to generally what you guys think about not answering the call, but knowing where God is calling you. You know, how to figure out that open door, or you know, I guess a preparation for that, or something along those lines.
Yeah, that's a great question. Rob, you got some things to say about that?
Well, Skip Heitzig said he looked for the most desolate, hard place on the planet and decided to go there. No. You know, I think, at least I can express personally, that I think it starts with a burden, and God just begins to give you a burden for a place. And it could be, you could have a connection there, like family, or, you know, so I think it's just born, it's what I've seen, it's just kind of born through, you know, that of just that prayer, seeking the Lord, you know, you letting him know, hey, I'm open to go anywhere. And, you know, maybe you hear at church, or you hear, you know, through this, so, hey, you know, there's a need. Somebody wants you to start praying about it and see if God moves on your heart. And what I've found is when God gives you a burden for something, it doesn't go away. You know, sometimes people get really excited about, you know, they hear about something, oh, I feel called here, and then like a month later, they're like, you know, I'm thinking about here now. And when God gives you a burden about a place, it doesn't go away. I mean, you can't get rid of it. It's like it just starts to grow. So,
ditto. We have one of our churches we planted up in North County, and the pastor just went through that exact thing. He was one of our assistant pastors, and God just gave him a burden for his community. And he couldn't get rid of it, and he was praying, and then he started to imagine, gosh, if I were in this city, this is what I would do, you know, and then he got a vision. And he said, they should do this, someone should do this, and boy, this would be a great place for an Easter service, and, you know, they should do this. And he started getting a vision, and then that burden and vision grew into a passion. He was consumed, and just night and day, just could not get it off his mind. And then he realized, oh, God, are you calling me? And so kind of those steps. But discerning God's will has many dimensions to it. You know, get a multitude of counsel, of course, but don't listen to everybody. You know, having the peace that passes all understanding, searching the scriptures, knowing you're called, the gifting. You know, if you can't preach, Spurgeon says, then God hasn't called you to preach. You know, if he hasn't given you the pipes, you know, the gifting. And so those dimensions, the upward, inward, and outward aspect of our call, the upward, the providence of God as he gives you a burden, as he's so arranged your life for such a time as this. And then the inward aspect, the passion, the burden where, you know, like Jeremiah says, I quit. And yet the word was burning in his heart. He couldn't keep it in. He had to do what God had made him for. And then the outward aspect, the gifting. And how does God use you? And what is the fruit of your life? And all of that will flow into that you don't have to strive or stress. Wisdom from above is pure, peaceful, gentle. But it doesn't mean it's not hard. It could be very hard, but yet peaceful to know that. So I just agree.
Yeah, I would just add to that, in addition to a sense of a burden, look where there's a place where there's need. We probably don't need another Calvary Chapel in Orange County. I think somebody's going to, you know, park a ferry 20 miles off the coast so they can start something in Orange County without an existing Calvary being there. That'd be about the only way you could do it. So looking for a place where there's need. And then as Miles shared with us in his first session today, sometimes God's going to close the door. I was pastoring in Oregon. The church was thriving. I was serving as an interim pastor. My wife and I, we put our house up for sale. If somebody had offered $1 for our house, oh, it must be the Lord's will. And God, in His grace, did not allow that offer. And yet, when the opportunity came to plant a Calvary Chapel in Camarillo, halfway between Los Angeles and Santa Barbara, closer to Los Angeles, so you guys don't think I went there because it'd be closer to Santa Barbara, closer to Los Angeles. But in Camarillo, God just opened the doors very rapidly. And Camarillo wasn't even on my radar, so to speak. But I developed a burden for the people, burden for the place. You're going to have a passion for the people to endure the struggles in ministry. As Pastor Mickey said, there'll be nothing in your life that'll be more difficult, presumably, than this challenge, and nothing more rewarding. And to endure, you're going to have to love God and love the people and love the place. But Anit?
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that when the door does open and you already have a desire, because I think a lot of these things begin with a desire, and then when the door opens, go through it. I had the privilege of teaching at the Bible College for 7 years, and every single semester, as I would teach there would be students that were trying to discern God's call. And I remember I would share this about God would start with a desire and then give an open door and then go through the door. And one time specifically, this girl came up to me with tears in her eyes, and she's telling me that this is her last semester at the Bible College. She's always had it on her heart to serve God, very specifically, at an orphanage in the Philippines. Okay, that's a pretty specific desire. And she said, well, there's this opportunity to serve at an orphanage in Bacolod, the Philippines, and I don't know if it's God's will. I was like, what? Like, I don't know why you have a hard time. She goes, I think I need to pray about it some more. I said, well, maybe, but I think you need to go through the door. So when the door opens, go through the door. Amen. Well, I was just talking with Rick Dossett during the break, and if you look at a map of where Calvary Chapel is in California, one of the areas where there's a big black hole is L.A. And then if you look at just California in general, Escondido here, it's 49% Hispanic and growing. And so I think that there obviously is a huge need in the Latino population throughout California. Specific details, I'm not sure I can give you specific details on the best route. I don't know if anybody else has.
Yeah, Luce, I would just make the comment, Rick Doucette, who's here with us. And Rick, could you raise your hand for anybody who hasn't had the privilege of meeting yet? Here's Rick. Okay, and Rick would be a real vital resource, but one of the suggestions, the questions asked about the Spanish community. First of all, the Church Planner Training Manual has been translated into Spanish language, and so you and the core team that you would build around you want to go through those materials with the core team. Second thing is that you want to invest time in the relationship with the people. If you're talking about a suburb of Los Angeles, it's different than Metro LA. And so you need to be sensitive to that culture and trying to get a sense the people that you're ministering to, whether it's an Asian culture, a Latino culture, a Caucasian culture, whatever it is it a transient population or is it a stable population? For example, Camp Pendleton, you're going to have, or any campus area, you're going to have people rotating in and out. So you want to get a sense in that community, is there stability? And are those people that you can use to build a core team that'll be a foundation for work, and then invest in them to train would be helpful. And generally speaking, I grew up as an Orthodox Jew, and God called me to Camarillo, said I was going to be ministering to Catholics. And I said, God, I'm a nice Jewish boy. What are you telling me? Oi. So sometimes you're going to discover that people that you will attract and people who are part of your team may not have been the people that you expected to be the most effective before you started. I'm like the whitest guy you know. It's like scary. I have to distribute sunglasses to people in the congregation because of the glare. But I love preaching with Gentiles. It's like, can we laugh at that? Is that okay? Is that anti-Semitic? But you're going to find out that God's going to bring people to your team that may not have been in a particular demographic that you expected.
Hey guys doing? We actually are 1 year into our church plant, but I think this question is relevant for a lot of people. I work full time. So just some really some helpful things on managing time, practical stuff. Because for a lot of people, when you go out to church plant, you will have to work full time.
Yeah, Bruce, I think you worked for how many years as a senior pastor, full-time in another job?
My first 7 years, I didn't receive any salary from the church, was my experience. Some thoughts would be, start understanding your priorities. Second, you don't need to do everything. As soon as you can get things on your not-to-do list instead of your to-do list, you're going to be much healthier and balanced. So as you can start raising up people to oversee areas of ministry, whether it's prayer, ushers, hospitality, counseling, and get it off of your plate and train them and continue to communicate with them, but get it off of your plate and plan to be an enduring farmer. Farmers work really hard. And so they're interesting. There's a company in the Midwest that just in the steel industry, Nucor, because of their hiring, they would hire farmers for management rather than hiring people who necessarily knew the steel industry per se, because they knew that the farmers would work harder than most people who were middle-level managers. So they looked to people with that kind of work ethic. And so I would suggest when Paul says be an enduring farmer in faith, waiting for the harvest to come in, be prepared to work and to be diligent.
Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, one of the things I would add to that, and you guys feel free to disagree with me and be wrong, but no, just kidding. One of the things I made this mistake when I went to Oregon. I've seen a lot of guys make this mistake. I think is a mistake, and what I would say is this: is look to do one thing well. And so what I mean by that is, I had Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, but we didn't have that many people, and we're trying to do, because it's what my church did back home. So we're trying to do, these 3 services and, have women's groups and men's groups and I think that a better way is to do one thing really, really well until the demand, means that you have to add something else. So I would do Sunday morning and do it as well as you can for as long as you can, until the need arises to add whatever it might be. So that's something I've kind of learned by the hard way, I think.
Anything to add, Mickey?
No, the prioritizing is very important. Keeping Christ the center. Sometimes people have the paradigm it's God first, family second, ministry, and that's not script. That's not in the Bible anywhere. In fact, it says, love your enemy as yourself, loves your neighbor as yourself, love your wife as yourself. So it's but it's being Christ-centered, Christocentric, that Christ is the center of my job, because that is ministry. There's no secular or sacred. Your job is your ministry. Christ-centered family, Christ-centered, and sometimes you're going to need, my family needs more time right now, so I need to get that back in order. Sometimes, no, the ministry is needing more of that time. But again, raising up and delegation, kind of my ministry primer I grew up in and my paradigm that I serve within, Robert Coleman's Master Plan of Evangelism, just the old classic, but the investment in Jesus Christ and that process, how he multiplied himself. And as I was listening to Bruce, he was describing the early church and what they did. And finally, it just got overwhelming. In Acts 6, they had to look out among them for godly people that were of good reputation and all of that they did the deacon work to manage some of the administrative things of the church and those needs so they could be dedicated to the Word of God in prayer. But here's a warning. As the church grows, sometimes those leaders that you first invested in as deacons, because they were there, they were serving, they were helping, sometimes pastors make the mistake of moving them, and now when we get to a place of elders and oversight, those people become elders when that's not their gifts. Their gifts are deacons and servicing, and so sometimes those people can become a challenge when they're misplaced. You put them in a place of oversight or leadership when that's not their gifting. And so make sure people are ministering within their gifts as you delegate to them, because then they're fulfilled. That's how they're designed, and the ministry multiplies and flourishes.
I made that mistake. I've made a lot of mistakes. So I made that one where church was growing. I had some amazing deacons. We met in a school. We were a mobile church. We had the setup every single week. And anytime we did an outreach or something, these guys were amazing, incredible. But as the church started growing, there was a need for more people to be discipled. And so I naturally looked at these guys, and I'm saying to, one of them, hey, John, here's this guy. I want you to meet him. Why don't you start meeting with him, and 3 weeks later, hey, John, how's it going? We haven't met yet, and I started getting really, really frustrated at these guys because I'm thinking, like, what is the deal? And this dear brother in our church, just pointed out to me, like, everything that they were doing that was so well. And the Lord just spoke to me so clearly. He said, look, these are great deacons. Let them be deacons and start praying for some elders. But I tell you, I made that mistake, and I was so frustrated at some wonderful, great guys because they weren't being what I thought that they were supposed to be rising up to when they were being exactly what God wanted them to be. So,
anybody else?
Okay, one of my struggles is I've had a burden to go to a certain area of the world for a while, and then you let circumstances of life work themselves out, and you pray and you serve and you watch and you listen, but then along the way, other things start coming exposed to other areas, to where even maybe a burden would start to develop. Now, my wife, who we've just been married a couple years, the area that I'm called to, or feel that I'm called to, she's like, I'll let you know when the Lord tells me that, sort of. But at the same time, when we have missionaries come from other churches around, then she's like, oh, we're called to go to England, or we're called to go to Italy, or, just not the place where I feel I'm called to. Anyways, so now we're getting at this time where we're getting out to travel a little bit, and we've been going up into the area by Cambria, but it's San Luis Obispo, Cayucas, and there seems to be a little tug being there. So now we're trying to decide, or trying to hear clearly, and I think it was you that mentioned in the beginning how sometimes God can change your mind. What you might think is a burden, He might change, have someplace else in mind for you. So trying to discern if that's Him or if it's just what I want to do, is the question, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Anybody?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I actually do have something to say to that. I wanted to give you an opportunity, though. I think it's really important to recognize that a call to ministry is bigger than a location in which you're going to serve and fulfill that call. And so, when the Lord called me into ministry, He very specifically impressed upon my heart to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. Now, the location of that has changed from time to time. When I first started serving here, it was in youth ministry, and then from youth ministry it went on to serving at a Bible college setting, and then back to assisting my pastor here when Pat Kinney was the pastor here at the church. So the location and the specifics of that call may have been different, but the actual call to equip the saints for the work of the ministry has been the same. So I think sometimes developing that call and growing into that call and then seeing how the Lord will unfold how He wants you to use that specifically is really an important aspect to it.
Okay, I'll just add a couple quick thoughts. One, those of you who are married, many of you are, it's important that you and your spouse are, so to speak, on the same page. I think it's really helpful in life, in a marriage relationship, to share your dreams. Dreams are going to change either because they become fulfilled or they become impossible. Like, I know the Dodgers aren't calling me tomorrow to call me up to join their rotation, pitch like Sandy Koufax. The Jewish Hall of Fame for sports is like a closet somewhere in Brooklyn, so we don't have a lot of heroes, but I know that dreams become impossible. So I would just say to you that as you share your dreams with one another, if you don't continue to have dreams, you start to die, you rust, and it's a slow, painful death. But as you share your dreams, there's only 3 responses that you can give to one another. It's, I share that dream, I want to do it with you. I don't share that dream, but I want to support you in it, or over my dead body. And when your spouse is saying over my dead body, it's probably not the best time to be going out to a particular place to walk through it. Second thing, and saying this with a sober sense, is that you are called to lead in the marriage. As men, you're called to lead in your marriage, lead in your family, and as pastors, wives, you are there as the wife of your husband. If you have another calling in the church, that's fantastic, guys. We should let our wives walk in their calling. When we started in Camarillo, I thought, well, honey, you have to be the women's ministry overseer, and you have to oversee children's ministry because you're my wife. Nobody else will do it, so that's your calling. But that's rarely the case. So let your wife be who she is or isn't, according to what God's called her to be. But you're supposed to lead in this effort. Your wife is not the assistant pastor. So let her know that she's not the assistant pastor. And if she says, over my dead body, rethink about going to Cayucas. Okay, I hope that helps.
The only thing I would add, and I know Kevin and his wife well, they're from our church, but is I think, I do think that sometimes the Lord will send you somewhere where it's not where you would pick, you know? I mean, I'd probably be in Maui if I had a choice, you know? But
that one's taken, by the way.
I know it is.
Like 20 times.
Yeah, several guys, yeah. But, you know, where I went to in Oregon, I never, ever would have picked, like, this is where I want to live and spend the rest of my life. So I think, you know, you don't want to think about it in those ways, in those terms. And sometimes, especially I think our wife, the wife will maybe do that. But in the same way, I agree wholeheartedly with what Bruce just said, is your wife has to be on board or it's going to be miserable. So giving her time to just pray through and you praying together, you know, and seeing, like I said earlier, if she gets a burden, you know, for wherever you feel like you have a burden. And I personally wouldn't recommend, you know, going anywhere until that happens.
I know some of you guys have pastored churches and then moved on to other churches, maybe to plant, then to move on and plant again. How did you know when God was calling you that it was time to leave and to move on to do the next plant? Does that make sense?
You got fired.
I mean, again, that's discerning God's leading and will. It'll be different for every individual. Some of it's the burden. Some of it is you could be in the same ministry and God. I was started as the children's pastor, and that was my passion. My PhD's in marriage and family. I love kids, love family. Just that was everything. But all of a sudden, my passion eventually changed. You know, and eventually I was demoted from working with kids to work with adults. I mean, adults only have half a life left. It's like a waste of time. But it was this, like my passion started to change more pastorally to the care. So sometimes even within a ministry, those passions and the burdens can be changed. And I think it's always important to know that sometimes we have a destination in mind, and where God, the journey is the destination. And I know it wasn't in Joseph's heart to be the second to Pharaoh, and it definitely wasn't in his heart. I think I need to go to prison. Yeah, and some of those things, but God's working through failure. He's working through all these things, and brokenness, injustice. He's working His will. But, you know, discerning His will, again, you know, you always need to align your heart with Scripture. I taught at Talbot for a while. I did their doctorate of ministry courses in leadership. And denominational pastors from all over. I found that most were in to get their doctorate of ministry because they get a raise and salary in their denomination. So I was like, oh, you know, I thought they had a passion to learn and grow, and it was, no, they get a pay raise for this, so they're just enduring my classes. So, but it's interesting, one of the books I had them read as a devotional, you've probably all read, is Tale of Three Kings. You know, not a theological book, but just a heart book between David, Saul, and Absalom. But in hearing their stories, I just was amazed how everyone always thought they were the David when they were being the Absalom, but they thought their pastor they were serving under was always the Saul. And the Saul always thought they were the David, but they were the Saul creating Absaloms all around them, And it's like, how is this? And I'd hear these stories of all these, a majority of them. I'd say 90% of these pastors had gone through church splits. And yet God even uses that to multiply his kingdom. I don't know how he sorts all of that out and all the woundedness and things that are there. But I would encourage you, if God's leading on, it should always, again, resemble what is Christ-like. It's not causing harm. It's not out of bitterness. We can disguise our bitterness to move on and sense it as, God's calling me here. And really, it's out of bitterness we're doing what we're doing. So you need to really discern your motives. And that God's leading is confirmed by his word, your gifts, your calling. And his timing, though, might be different. For me to leave from Horizon, I've been there 35 years. And I was comfortable. And I saw where the ministry, it was, aging a little bit. And, the baby boomer group were growing older. But I got it worked out. I could do this in my sleep. And then I got a call on vacation. A woman who knows our family well just said, God spoke to me, all this. And she says, just listen. And then gave me this whole rundown, and that it was exactly what my wife and I were praying. And I had someone give me a prophecy a year to the day God spoke to them that I was be at the Rock, and God told them a year earlier that I was going to be at the Rock on that date. And I was like, and I didn't find this out till later. So there was all this that came to me, but I didn't want to go because I was fearful. Insecure on that. How do you leave something after 35 years? And what would my pastor think? And it was I needed to obey God and be obedient to God and be as graceful as I could, even though it was hard. And again, when I did go to where I was, I realized it was God working in me, not because of anything great I was going to do there for that reason. So make sure your motives are pure. And it's his leading, that it's peaceful, it's honorable, it's not divisive, and all those things that can happen, that it would always bear the fruit of the Spirit.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer from Dr. Mickey, but I'd just say two things. One, because Pastor Chuck has essentially modeled for us in the Calvary Chapel movement approximately 50 years in one place, we've assumed to some extent that is necessarily normative, but that is certainly, we don't want to put God in a box at all. There's many advantages of continuing in a place for a longer period of time, but God has seasons, and there's a season for everything. My suggestion, just joining with Mickey, is that if you sense that God is moving, you make sure that any transition is done responsibly. As leaders in the church, and whether it's pastor or another role of leadership, any transition you make should be done responsibly, and you want to be pouring into people so that will be seamless, and ideally those that you've handed the mantle to, the baton to, as God's called them, will be even more effective in their ministry than you had been, and that would be an ideal. So prepare people.
One of the things that I fear is getting comfortable. So I've always personally kind of lived with a mentality of I need to have my bags packed. I need to keep them packed, in the sense of just always being open to if God were to say, here's what's next, And so when I was a youth pastor at Calvary Vista, where I'm at now, I thought I was going to be there till the rapture. I loved it. I just loved, serving with my pastor, loved the church, loved the area. But then all of a sudden something happened where I started to get this just growing discontentment for California, which was really weird because I grew up here my whole life. But all of a sudden I just started feeling like, God, I hate California, and I knew that was part of what God was doing, to just kind of shake us up out of our, comfort zone and where we were at, to just begin to burden our heart for something else. So then we went to Oregon, and it was through somebody, one of my mentors, John Corson, asked me, hey, would you pray about coming up here? And he tried to get me to go to 5 different places. And finally, you know, the Lord, through somebody else, directed us where we ended up. So I'm in Oregon now and really enjoying it, loving it, thinking I'm going to be here because of that model that we've seen. I'm going to be here till the rapture, you know. And then I got the call to come back to Vista. But what was interesting, the whole time that we were in Oregon, didn't really miss California, but I missed the people at Calvary Chapel Vista. I missed the church. And that had never left me, you know, was the sense of that particular body. And so I think God sometimes just stirs in that type of, you know, way where you just start kind of feeling like, you know. And I think sometimes even when God's calling somebody to lead, is they might start looking at their church and thinking about, you know, if I was the pastor here, I would definitely do that different, you know. And that can be an okay thing if you don't start talking about it, you know. If that's something going on in your own heart, that could be an indication that God is calling you somewhere else, you know.
I just want to interrupt. I was with a Calvary pastor recently. He's been pastoring for 40 some odd years. And we were just having lunch, and I just said, what is the best part of the ministry to you? And he said, the people. I just love the people. I give my life for the people. And then I said, what's the hardest part of the ministry to you? And he goes, the people. I hate the people, you know. So they take my life, you know. It's just like, isn't that so true? You know, we will die for the people. It's the sweetest and the most difficult challenge of the church. Hence, Jesus died for those he loved.
Oh, come on.
Kind of a two-part question, I guess. One is, where do you see Calvary Chapel going as a movement as a whole? And then what are some of those places of great need strategically as you look to plant throughout the country? Where are there areas of need where there's, you know, I guess. Thank you.
Calvary Chapel going as a whole. What do you think, Rob? We'll turn that off if you want.
No, you know, I'm encouraged. I'm really encouraged by, you know, where we're headed. I think things, you know, like this network are, you know, really, really, you know, positive. And I feel like, you know, as long as we keep our minds and our hearts fixed on Jesus and we stay humble, you know, he has a place for us. And, you know, I think there's still, you know, so many unreached places still to go and, you know, and plant. And you know, I think that we see some other movements right now that are definitely having a greater impact with younger people, where we used to, you know, have a greater impact per se, you know, with younger people. But, you know, our churches we're older now. You know, our churches are older. And so I think the future's bright for Calvary. And, you know, as long as, you know, we stay focused on the right thing, and what do we say? Keep the main thing the main thing. So.
Bruce?
Yeah, as to the first part, I think the Calvary movement is going to do fantastic. It is the tendency of any organization or institution to move towards institutionalization. And so as a movement that's been around 40 plus years, there's some institutionality that's inherent. Yet Calvary's done a better job of resisting that than any denomination, movement, or association that I've heard of, and I've done some research on it to whatever extent that I have some expertise, so to speak. Because we're decentralized, it allows us to maintain a certain vibrancy that avoids or prolongs institutionalization. So by efforts such as the Church Planting Network and other initiatives that will be inevitable, it enters energy into the system that then acts as a catalyst that then expands. And we're seeing that. We've got over 400 people in 10 months who are involved in a brand new church planting initiative network. To those who sit outside of Calvary Chapel and study church movements, that's ridiculously phenomenal. So that's really encouraging. As to an area, I think that as we look at the book of Acts, metropolitan areas were a focus. Our movement has tended to focus more on suburban areas. So I think a greater awareness of needs in metropolitan areas would be a really wise thing to consider in the future. But I certainly wouldn't want to limit someone who is called to a rural or a suburban area. Okay, but I think metropolitan areas, because they become hubs of ideas, hubs of change in the culture. So there's plenty West Coast, East Coast, left coast, right coast, Midwest, where there's need.
Yeah, I think the first part of the question, the one thing that comes to my mind is that anything that has life or is growing experiences growing pains. And I think that to a certain extent there's some of that has happened in the last 10 years within Calvary Chapel, but that doesn't necessarily mean that its best days are behind it. I mean, I've read some things from people that say that, and I just don't think that that's the case. I think that we're experiencing what any movement would experience as you see a change of leadership. But I think that those who are involved in that change of leadership at the upper levels of Calvary are prayerful and looking at how best to navigate that. So I think it's a good thing. And then I would just echo what Bruce said about urban or metropolitan areas, that really Calvary Chapel has thrived mostly in suburban areas in the United States. I think that along with that, one of the things that church planters need to consider is that planting in an urban area would probably require that you be bivocational for your whole ministry. And I think that people thinking in that context, that it could mean that you're bivocational the entire time and that you pastor a relatively small church, even if it's in a big city. While we see some bigger name churches thriving in some metropolitan areas, I think a lot of the urban churches tend to be smaller, even if it's in a larger area. So even if you're in Manhattan and there's 8 million people in Manhattan, it doesn't mean that you're going to have an 8,000 member church. I mean, it might be 150 people or smaller, and living in a place like New York would probably require that you be bivocational and go into it thinking in that direction, that I'm going to pastor people but also work to support my family.
Why do you think that is?
That they're smaller? Yeah. I don't necessarily know if I have an answer as to why they are. It's just an observation. I think that we see in the churches that are held up as the ones that are doing a really good job are the ones that are 1,000 or more in those areas. But for every church that's 1,000 or more in those urban areas, there's probably 25 that are 100 or less. So.
Hipsters need Jesus too. Just remember that.
Bruce, you probably know this. What's the average size of a Calvary Chapel?
Well, I don't know the average size. We know just of Calvary Chapels per se. Demographically, over 85% of Protestant churches in the United States have an average adult attendance of under 100. So churches that have over 800 adults on Sunday are approximately 4% of all Protestant churches in the U.S., and those that have over 2,000 are less than 0.5% in the U.S.
And then you have the Rock Church, which is like 13 or 14,000. Yeah. It's a city in and of itself, yeah. Rick?
So say I want to go plant a church in a community, and I find out there's another Calvary nearby, and they're a little territorial. And so I want to plant my feet there. I feel like this is where God's calling me. How do I deal with that other Calvary church?
Call your church The Rock.
Or Cross Connection. Rob? We live in I think I could speak for our area. We live in an area with a lot of Calvary chapels, and I think that does happen. I don't necessarily think that that's the rule. I would say that it's not normative. If you take the time to get to know some of the people in the area, it's part of our flesh in general to be territorial, and I have to kind of challenge myself on that on a regular basis. There's another Calvary Chapel here in Escondido, and I'm blessed that there is, because there's plenty of people here. And so,
I'm not speaking on behalf of CC or Calvary Chapel, but I would agree with that. Starbucks seems to be able to do it. A Starbucks on every corner, and they are both prospering because of whatever reason. And personally, most churches pull together by relationship, and if we could all just realize it's God's church, and if some of the people leave from our location to your location, they feel better fed there or nurtured, then great. The more the merrier. The more churches we can plant, I think would be great. So,
You know, we're in Vista, and there's 11 Calvary chapels within probably 8 minutes of our church. But there are 400,000 people in North County that aren't going to church anywhere. And, I heard John Corson say something once where he said, I think God brings people into a church for a season. And that season might be a week, it might be a month, it might be a year, it might be 10 years. And there's something that he wants them to learn there, and there's something that the Lord wants them to give to that church. And when that season's over, he might move them on and might move them to the church, right down the street or right around the corner. And that's okay. And what we need to do is to focus on not who's not there, but who is there, and who God has given to us to minister to and shepherd.
We just launched East County Campus out in El Cajon as a multi-site from our location. And 4 of the large churches out there, Shadow Mountain, Foothills, a couple of the pastors, they contacted our campus pastors, said, we are so glad you're in our neighborhood. There's people you're going to reach that we're not reaching. We love it that you're here. We want to work together. It's just like, yeah, that's the mentality. And we're not trying to draw people from other churches. In fact, the way, and those of you that know The Rock, a lot of people come to the Lord there, and then we actually encourage them to go to other churches to get grounded to where they're going to grow. We get to benefit other churches by our strong evangelistic gifts, and we benefit other churches. We benefit from them and some of their missionary things that they're doing, and so that's the kingdom mindset. I just love those guys out there.
Rick, I would just encourage communication. We had a church planter had a heart to plant in Portland, Oregon, and so approximately 90 days beforehand, he communicated with all of the Calvary Chapel pastors within a 20-mile radius, telling them about the vision, then invited them to a meeting where I flew up with him as a sending church to meet with all of these pastors to not only share the vision, just to encourage a sense of camaraderie, that this one guy had been to a church planting training program, that he was qualified, that he was gifted. They welcomed him with open arms. There's been no sense of friction, no sense of tension or conflict. So I think some of that communication helps to remove those barriers. And usually in the room, if you've got one person who is, let's say, territorial afraid, in a group of 15 or 20 people, and 19 are saying, we're all excited about this, is great for the kingdom, and the one guy who wants to say, not in my backyard, sometimes think, gosh, maybe there's another perspective to consider, and that can be really helpful rather than just being a church planter having a one-on-one, quote, confrontation with someone who is reluctant. So I think that dynamic can help in a training process. And then communication with CCA, Calvary Chapel Association, regional leaders.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that I was talking with one of the guys who's connected with Calvary Church Planting Network with Bill Walden up in the Bay Area is that they had a guy come and do just that, came and met with Bill, that he wanted to plant a church in that general area. And it was actually a place that Bill and their church was looking at planting a church, and they were able to say, hey, we're actually really excited you're doing that. So I think by doing that, taking that time to communicate with the people in that area. So, that old saying about if it bleeds, it leads in the news. I think sometimes you hear the worst case scenarios where there is someone who's territorial, but I just think it's the exception and not the rule.
Let me just add to what Rob said. We did a demographic in around our church, just because we're really trying to reach out to the community and meet the wounds and the hurts and the brokenness. And so we did a study just 10 miles. I'll just read this to you. Within 10 miles of the Rock, there's 32 drug treatment centers, rehabs, 5 homeless shelters, 12 battered women's rescue centers, 457 AA meetings every week, 315 bars within 10 miles, 280 liquor stores, 49 escort services, 11 abortion clinics, 17 adult bookstores, 11 strip clubs, and statistically 8 murders, last year, 174 rapes, 287 armed robberies, 3,142 car thefts, and 73 Starbucks. Thought I'd throw that in there.
I like how you listed that in there. Yeah.
So, I mean, there is so much need
So
in
is
the
Starbucks
community.
causing it? Is probably
Yeah, it's probably it.
Yeah.
But if within 10 miles there could be 73 Starbucks, I mean, imagine what hope we can bring to a community with that much pain and that much brokenness.
Yeah, I read an article in Newsweek like 5 years ago about Starbucks. It may have been a little bit more, but it was right about the time that Starbucks started putting Starbucks in grocery stores and all these different places. And one of the things that this article said was that Starbucks found that they could put a Starbucks on the opposite side of a street and double their profits because people don't like to turn left. Yeah. So, interesting.
In regards to the network, I don't go to Calvary Chapel. I don't go to a Calvary Chapel church. Do you have people from outside the movement asking to be a part of the network, and how does that work?
Yeah, our focus is solely on helping to plant healthy Calvary Chapel churches. And so we have people that have approached, have heard about Calvary Chapel and found some interest, and as they start going through the church planner training manual or other resources, they start to connect with the DNA, and they say, yeah, I want to take the steps to be a Calvary Chapel, be involved in Calvary Chapel. But that is our exclusive focus. Because, for example, I don't have something against my Reformed brothers, but we're not planting Reformed churches. And there's clear theological and philosophical differences. And so if I muddy or confuse the doctrine issue, then I'm making people less effective in the work they're trying to do. So our focus is solely in seeing healthy Calvary Chapel churches planted. And we invite those who are interested in planting Calvary Chapels to get involved and be prepared to do that. And so if someone has great involvement in Calvary Chapel, extensive ministry experience in Calvary Chapel, it would probably take them less time to be prepared than someone who's coming in from outside of the movement to be part of the tribe. Yeah. And we had the big circumcision ritual at the end, and that's it's communion ritual.
Marty?
Yes, if someone is seeking to start a church and they're waiting on the Lord to show them a location, and they're already at their church serving, and they're in a handful of ministries, is it wise counsel to maybe like back out of all but let's say one ministry, or somehow downsize so they can spend time seeking the Lord? So what was your guys' counsel on that?
Well, again, it would be the leading of the Holy Spirit. I wouldn't say do this or don't do this. The Holy Spirit has to lead a person in those steps and the process. Again, He'll confirm it in their heart. If things are out of balance or things are starting to fall apart because they're overstretched, that'll become evident through the fruit of their life. So yes, at times you would need to cut back and focus in new direction. But it has to be the leading of the Lord, His timing. He'll often raise up someone where you're not needed in this area. He's replaced you there. And so you can let go of certain things as He's preparing you for other things.
I think, what Mickey said earlier is so true, that so much about ministry isn't so much what God is wanting to do through us as it is what He's wanting to do in us. And He can use anybody. So oftentimes what we're doing, serving in our local church, is part of His preparation for what He's wanting to do in us, for what He's going to do through us later.
Yeah, I would just add that it's kind of like when you're driving and you see a yellow warning sign. For example, you see a sign that says there's a fork in the road. That sign is not the fork, but it tells you that the fork's coming. You're going to have to turn either right or turn left. So it gets you prepared. For example, if you had a heart to go in the mission field, it might be a good idea to get a passport. So same thing, that if you knew that God could call you into a new place, quote, tomorrow, you need to start to prepare people to pass those ministries on to. That process might take 30 days or it might take 90 days. It could take a year depending on the nature of the ministry. So you start preparing people, and that gives God the opportunity then to move you through those open doors, I think.
And circumcision might be part of it. That happened to Timothy, right?
And
then
with
he could go in the pool up to his waist.
One of the things that my pastor here taught me when I first stepped into ministry was to delegate and duplicate. And really, over the course of the last 15 years involved in different ministry, Rob had mentioned something earlier that I could totally identify with. When I first started as a youth pastor, I thought, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. I could do this forever. And that wasn't the case, and it didn't turn out to be that way. But I very quickly, even though I loved what I was doing, was trying to hand off to other people around me all those areas of the ministry so that when the time did come, I wasn't imagining that it would, but about 3 or 4 years later, when the door opened for me to leave the youth ministry, the guy who took over from me was already teaching the Wednesday night service. He was already doing almost all the administration for the youth ministry. I mean, it was just a seamless transition. And so I think that the idea of working yourself out of a ministry position to bring other people into the ministry is just a great rule to live by. And that, I would say, of all the things that really stood out to me as a kid, when we first came to Calvary Chapel, we started attending Calvary Chapel Escondido when I was 11 years old. And the thing that really stood out to me was that the people who were a part of the church were doing the ministry. And you did not need to have a degree or your PhD to do ministry unless you're Mickey Stonier. So I think that idea of handing ministry off to other people, getting them involved, and having that as a rule, then when the time does come, if the Lord calls you on, it is a seamless transition. We want to make sure that we end when we said we were going to end today, so we're going to wrap it up here. If you have any further questions, myself and Bruce will be sticking around. I don't know if these guys need to take off immediately. We'd love to talk with you, but I wanted to let the guy who likes to talk about circumcision give the famous last words. So,
yeah, we just want to encourage you. We are excited that you're here. We know that you're here for a reason, that God is stirring you. More information is available to us. You can contact us at info@ccpnetwork.org. You can send requests to Miles or to myself at ccpnetwork.org. Go on the website, see the resources that are available for you. We were optimistic that many of your questions would be answered, and to the extent that questions exist that didn't get answered today, we want to encourage you to follow up with us. We're here for you. We're here to serve you. That's our purpose. Lord, we thank you for every heart that's represented here, not only, Lord, for those that are gathered here, but those that will be influenced by those that are gathered here. We trust, Lord, that for your good purpose and your glory, that you're stirring our hearts to contemplate and to consider what this might look like to plant a Calvary Chapel church, a healthy Calvary Chapel. And so, Lord, help us to be an encouragement to one another. Help us to be prepared to do the work that you've called us. And Father, may it always be motivated by love and your glory. And we ask this now in Jesus' name. Amen.
God bless you all. Thank you for coming.